So I'm very pleased to be here to kind of chair this session. As I was saying, this stems out of some earlier work, which I think has struck quite a chord with the wider public. So we had this event in the moment, I'll post the links in the chat. We had this panel session which was kind of virtual tour, kind of publicly facing talk, which we gave in November, and we were then invited to appear on BBC Radio 3. So we kind of went on Radio 3 and we had this, and we really struck by the really wide interest in the history of charity shops that people have. I think there's this really kind of strong interest among people, among a kind of wider public, in the state of the charity sector, the kind of the appearance of these shops on their streets. And we're really keen to kind of show that there's a really broad and wide history to charity retail that most people don't really know a huge amount about. So that's why we've convened this session again today. And we're trying to do what I always like to do in any kind of session on charity archives that I'm involved with, is bring together those that preserve the records that through which historians write the history of charity and voluntary organisations. And that's kind of working with the archivists and the heritage managers, as well as historians who kind of use and interpret those sources, as well as a kind of a more contemporary reflection from somebody really at the coalface of the kind of the charity retail sector. So I'm really, really pleased that we've got such a great panel for you today. So we're going to take those papers in order as on the abstract that you should have seen. So we're going to start with Ruth Macdonald, who is the archivist and deputy director of the Salvation Army Heritage Centre. We'll then have Sarah Roddy from Maynooth University, Campbell Gosling from the University of Wolverhampton, and we'll finish with some reflections from Robin Osterley, who is the chief executive of the Charity Retail Association. So I hope you'll agree that that's a really nice kind of balanced panel. And I will put the links in the chat because they didn't seem to work when I copy pasted them. The only other link I wanted to put in was to the wider project that I'm involved with, which is a project on charity archives. This link should work. So this is the project that is a British Academy supported project that has been running now for 7 years. We have at least another 3 or 4 years. We may have another 5 years after that. It's a very long running project, and it really is an important project that helps to raise awareness of the vulnerability of the source base through which kind of historians and researchers into charity often rely on, which is the archives and records of voluntary organisations. They are often particularly vulnerable, both because they are not often the key priority of voluntary organisations, because they have obviously kind of other kind of key goals that they need to achieve, and also because they're vulnerable in a wider sense, because the entire archive sector at the moment has become particularly vulnerable through funding cuts. But I'm really pleased that we have got an archivist from a charity archive here to speak to us about that. So I will stop talking now, and I'm going to hand over to Ruth, who is going to kick us off with this great panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for the introduction, and thanks also to you and George for organising this panel. Hopefully you can now see my slides and hear me, and if not, I hope someone will let me know, but yeah, otherwise I'll just launch right in. For many people today, it's through retail that they know the Salvation Army. They're familiar first and foremost with its charity shops. That's increasingly the case here in the UK, where there are now over 400 Salvation Army shops nationwide, but it's particularly true in North America, where the Salvation Army has become almost a byword for charity shop. Most people are aware that the Salvation Army is a Christian charity, but they may not be aware that it is an evangelical Christian church as well. If they are, that awareness may well have come about through another form of retail in the figure of the uniformed war cry herald, who they might have met selling the magazine in the pub or on their local high street. So retail is a vital feature of the Salvation Army's public face, but for an organisation that began in the 1860s as a Christian mission to unchurched people in the East End of London, this wasn't by any means a foretrodden trajectory. Nor is it a recent development. Retail became formally established as a strategic part of the Salvation Army's work in the early 1880s, in a move that sparked decades-long controversy and debate among the organisation's members because it appeared to run counter to some of its founding principles. And as the Salvation Army grew over the course of the 1880s and 90s and its retail activities expanded further, they also provoked criticism from wider society too. The early development of Salvation Army retail occupies what I see as a transitional and experimental phase in charity retail between the rise of the charity bazaar as the predominant form in the early to mid-19th century, as documented by the historian Frank Prochaska, and the forms of retail that we're more familiar with in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That is, charity shops with strong brand identities that sell mostly second-hand goods, but sometimes also a range of ethical or socially conscious new products. In my view, it's this that makes the Salvation Army such an important and interesting object of study in the history of charity retail. Examining why they persisted with retail so tenaciously in the face of criticism and internal opposition in their early years can help to understand the value that retail was recognised to have for charitable organisations beyond straightforward fundraising. And as my fellow panellists Sarah Roddy and her colleagues Julie Marie Strange and Bertrand Tafe have recently shown in their book, The Charity Market and Humanitarianism in Modern Britain, because the Salvation Army experimented with so many different forms of retail in such enterprising ways, by looking at its early history, we can also see the origins of the forms of retail, charity retail that we know today, but also other forms that haven't stood the test of time. In my short paper today, I'll aim to give an overview of some of the huge variety of retail projects and activities that the Salvation Army has incorporated into its work, particularly in the late 19th century, which has been the focus of my own research and is also the period and the time period when most of the organisation's retail practices emerged. I'll also outline some of the criticisms and debates surrounding this retail activity and the arguments that were used to justify it. And then I'll provide a few concluding thoughts on the effect that these factors have had on the archival record and some of the challenges and opportunities for research. So the Salvation Army began life in 1865 in the East End of London, but it wasn't originally called the Salvation Army. Known by a number of names in its early years, the name the Christian Mission was settled upon once it began expanding outside of London in 1869. Its founders, William and Catherine Booth, were former Methodists, and they were concerned for the souls of those living in areas of high poverty who tended not to attend established churches. Although the Christian Mission made some efforts to attend to the practical and bodily needs of its target congregation, its main focus at this point was their spiritual redemption rather than charitable relief. It sought to capture their attention by repurposing aspects of popular secular culture for religious purposes, converting a tavern into its first headquarters and reading room, and preaching in theatres and music halls. In 1878, the mission changed its system of governance, and tapping into the jingoism that had been popularised in music halls at the time, it took the military as its model for a new, more hierarchical structure. Soon after, its name was changed to the Salvation Army, and well-known features like the uniforms and brass bands were also adopted around this time too. So literature was the first product that was sold by the organisation to raise funds for its work. The Christian Mission produced a monthly magazine which was sold to supporters, and its leaders were prolific writers of books and pamphlets. When the Christian Mission became the Salvation Army, publishing ramped up. In 1879, it established its own printing works, and its former monthly magazine was replaced by the weekly war cry newspaper. Pushing the war cry became an important part of membership of the Salvation Army. It was promoted as important soul-saving work for both the seller and the buyer. But in case that wasn't impetus enough, a national competition was established. League tables of weekly sales took up a whole page of each war cry, with the system replicated for the children's newspaper, The Little Soldier, when it was established in 1881. Salvation Army members, who are known as soldiers, were particularly encouraged to sell the war cry in public houses to spread the organisation's temperance message. Although these league tables are long gone, this practice, which is known as pub booming, carries on to this day. The reorganisation of the missionary movement into an army created other opportunities for retail that were quickly seized upon, with uniform being the first step. A regulation uniform was developed in the early 1880s and manufactured in-house. This was conceived of as an opportunity to offer stable, respectable employment to converts, keeping them away from the temptations of their former sinful life, and at the same time, as a way of diverting into the organisation all the money that converts saved when they gave up sinful entertainments like alcohol and gambling. Roddy, Strange and Taith have aptly coined this the purchase-triggered donation. The Salvation Army's membership was largely low-waged, and buying a full uniform could be a big ask, but its component parts, the bonnets, caps, jackets, skirts, trousers, and embroidered guernseys, could be purchased gradually, one piece at a time, and some smaller, more affordable tokens of membership, such as badges and ribbons, were also devised and sold. The success of these small purchase-triggered donations must have been immediately apparent, as the product range quickly began to expand to other household goods, such as brushes and tableware, which the Salvation Army took the step of trademarking in 1884, making its crest, a symbol that was steeped in religious meaning, into a brand. A trade department was created to run this work and still operates today under the name that was adopted in 1917 when it became a limited liability company called Salvationist Publishing and Supplies. It was this expansion beyond the range of what could be considered reasonable accoutrements of belonging to a religious organisation, modest dress and suitable reading material, that sparked the first objections to Salvation Army retail. Was trade not a distraction from the organisation's religious purpose? Was the unscrupulous world of modern business not incompatible with upstanding moral conduct? And would the mercenary practice not put off wealthy benefactors whose potential donations could far outstrip the proceeds that could be gained from retail? Well, the Salvation Army's leaders staunchly defended their growing retail trade as both a source of income that had the added bonus of diverting money away from sin, and an important auxiliary to its evangelism. So that Salvation Army tea set or clock served as a daily reminder to the soldier of her religious calling, and might also provide the opportunity for her to evangelize to her house guests. There was also the social dimension that I mentioned earlier, that in-house production served the function of providing stable employment for converts who were in precarious circumstances, and offered them the opportunity not only to work, but to work for God. The Salvation Army ventured further into social work in the course of the 1880s and 90s, and this is when its retail and manufacturing activities really ballooned and diversified. From 1883, the Salvation Army began undertaking rescue work for women, providing short to medium-term homes and training for so-called fallen women. In these homes, work was viewed as an important part of the reformative process. It gave staff time to speak to residents about their soul as they worked together on stitching an apron or knitting socks. It was considered vital to instill residents with a good work ethic to ensure their futures outside the home. But when combined with retail, their work could also serve to recoup some of the costs of maintaining them during their stay. The rescue wing consequently developed its own retail systems that remained largely distinct from the retail functions unified within the Salvation Army's trades department. For both the main trade department and the rescue work, one of the most important means of selling their wares was by mail order. Their products were advertised in the War Cry and other Salvation Army newspapers and magazines, of which there were 4 by the end of the 1880s. This gave their products a national and even an international reach, because the Salvation Army had already begun expanding overseas. The trade department also had its own very large central London premises by the mid-1880s, which seems to have served simultaneously as warehouse, factory, and department store. However, the rescue work had no such premises, and so it sought out other ways of making face-to-face sales, which were important for justifying the retail as evangelical, because they afforded chances for spiritual and pastoral conversations with customers. Stalls would be set up at Salvation Army meetings and events, but the most notable way that the rescue work found face-to-face sales was by employing peddlers or commercial travellers, also known as lollards in Salvation Army terminology, although we don't quite know why. These peddlers, all women, travelled the country from door to door, selling goods made by rescued women and spreading the word of the gospel. By the early 20th century, the Salvation Army had a very sophisticated peddling network with peddling grounds mapped out carefully to avoid overlap. It's not known exactly when this practice died out, but it seems to have disappeared by the mid-20th century. Following its successful entry into the field of social work for women, a wider programme encompassing men and women was launched in 1890. Known as the Darkest England scheme after this book, it laid out its overall shape, this book which laid out its overall shape and objectives, incorporated manufacturing and retail in several ways. The scheme created a range of institutions aimed at giving workless or low-paid men a hand up out of the sea of poverty. These included elevators and salvage wharves, which had a dual function of transforming waste material and what was disparagingly referred to at the time as waste humanity into useful products and useful workers. The elevator workshops began to supply the trade department with its products, and it was out of the salvage work that some of the first recognisable charity shops emerged. Called salvage stores, these sold recovered second-hand items to poor customers at low prices. The Darkest England scheme drew criticism from outside observers and trade unions who accused the Salvation Army of using sweated labour, of muddying the waters between charity and commercial activity, and of using its privileged position as a charity to unfairly compete with and undercut the prices of commercial competitors. The Salvation Army denied sweating, instead arguing that its Darkest England workshops and its factories were examples of model working conditions. And where it did seek to compete with commercial rivals, as it did most notably when it opened its own match factory, producing phosphorus-free safety matches not far from the notorious Bryant and May match factory, it did so in order to set an example and promote socially conscious purchasing in an early form of consumer activism, as Flora Jansen will argue in an article forthcoming later this year. So I've only really managed to scratch the surface of Salvation Army's retail history today, but I'll just conclude now with some thoughts on the challenges of documenting and researching this history from my perspective as an archivist. My first thought really is about terminology. So far in this paper, I've referred to war cry heralds, to pub booming, to pushing the war cry, and to lollards, not to mention the variety and the more easily recognisable terms I've used, like retail, trade, peddling. And this poses a challenge to any researcher or archivist trying to identify relevant records in the catalogue. Which search terms should they be using? My second thought is about the methods that archivists use to decide which records should be retained permanently. For the Salvation Army's early history, which I've been talking about today, it's very much an accident of history which records have survived to come down to us. But even as we now take a more planned approach to record retention, archivists will often employ a form of functional appraisal, which means that we preserve a greater quantity of records that document a department or organisation's core activities, and only the bare minimum for auxiliary activities. In the case of the Salvation Army, the core activities are evangelism and social work. Retail is framed both historically and today as an auxiliary to these activities. However, as I've hopefully shown, although it was auxiliary, it was very heavily integrated into most of the core activities. So records of it do survive, but often they're somewhat hidden in records of more substantive activities, and so it can be a challenge to find them. I think archivists and researchers need to, and mostly do, communicate well to ensure we understand one another's interests and methods and concerns. And it's incumbent upon us as archivists to apply that knowledge to how we select, appraise and catalogue archives, resources permitting, of course. And when it comes to charity archives, resources are a very big question. One final consideration is the fact that the trading arm of a charity is often registered as a separate company, so its records may not actually form part of the main institutional archive. So extra care and awareness may be required to ensure that these records are preserved. And so hopefully that provides some topics that we can discuss at the end of the panel once my fellow speakers have presented their papers. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So yeah, we can share our appreciation for that fantastic talk in the usual Zoom clapping fashion. I think it's always interesting to see how these points about objections to the retail arm of a charity are nothing new at all. You know, there's nothing new here. They go way back to the 19th century, as you presented. So Sarah's now sharing, which is great. And I also really like that reflection on how the specificities of an auxiliary function for a charity are even more hidden than other records potentially. So that's definitely something we can pick up later. But now I'm delighted to hand over to Sarah Roddy of Maynooth University, but that's very new, isn't it, Sarah? My knowledge of you really is at the University of Manchester, but it looks like it's a very recent move there.
Yes, it's a move as of January this year. So I can recommend moving countries in a global pandemic, definitely.
Well, it keeps you occupied at least. Something to do in those January days, unpacking boxes, I guess. Please take it away.
Okay, so the usual warning always comes in these panels. There are some workmen next door who are using hammers, and they have stopped for the moment. If they start again, I apologise. So I just want to start by thanking George and Georgina for organising this panel and for inviting me along. And this is a paper that comes from a wider project on the financial relationship between the Irish Catholic Church and its lay people, broadly in the late 19th, early 20th century, which I've been working on for some time. And there is a book underway, and I'm not entirely set on whether this material that I'm presenting today will go into the book, but if it does, it will go into a chapter which looks at religious figures, bishops, priests, nuns, and so on, as economic actors, as economic leaders and arbiters within their communities. But obviously what I'm saying also is influenced by a previous collaborative project, which Ruth kindly mentioned in her paper, which is the charity market and humanitarianism in Britain, which I wrote with Judy Marie Strange and Bertrand Chait, and which touched on some of the issues that I'll discuss today, obviously in the British context, and I'm looking at them in the Irish context. So issues like charity enterprise marketing or charity enterprise sale of charitable goods, and I think also importantly this idea of charities operating within a wider economy. So the immediate historical context for this paper is a phenomenon in the late 19th century of philanthropic efforts to encourage industry in rural Ireland as a way of providing skills, employment, and usually wages to people in various localities, but particularly in the very poor regions in the south and west of the country. And these efforts usually involved textile industries, so the manufacture and the sale of things like lace and linen and woolens, and they were often female-led. So women were not just overwhelmingly the recipients of the training and employment on offer, but more well-to-do women were often very high-profile supporters and donors to these enterprises as well. And of course, in the case of convent industries, nuns were most often the founders and managers and overseers of these enterprises. So convent industries of various sizes and durability and seriousness were set up by many religious orders of nuns across Ireland in the 1890s in particular. And I'm going to focus in this paper on two of the more prominent ones, I suppose, here. So I'll essentially, over the next few minutes, compare the woolen industry, which was set up by the Sisters of Charity in Foxford in County Mayo. And I see that my map has, I think I've moved the map, so my stars have moved, but I'll have to do it with my cursor. Foxford's around here in the west of Ireland, and then Skibbereen is down here along the south coast in County Cork. And in Skibbereen, we're talking about a weaving industry, a linen industry, which was formed there. So both started around the same time and in a similar manner. The Sisters of Mercy started their linen weaving workshop at their convent in Skibbereen in 1889. And the Sisters of Charity started their woolen mill in Foxford in 1891-92. And individual sisters were key in the initiation of both operations. So it was Mother de Sales in the case of Skibbereen. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of her, and Mother Agnes Murrell Bernard in the case of Foxford. Both enterprises also strikingly had initial input of expertise and advice from Protestant textile entrepreneurs based in Ulster. Ulster then, of course, being the powerhouse of Irish industry. So Sir William Ewart of Belfast and John Charles Smith of Tyrone advised and provided equipment at Skibbereen and Foxford respectively. You know, both obviously persuaded of the virtue of encouraging industry in what were among the poorest regions of the island. Even though the sort of cooperation between northern Protestant Orangemen in some cases and Catholic nuns was seen as unusual. In fact, in both cases, it's what happened here. Both enterprises also attracted positive publicity and praise for providing skills and employment to women and girls in their areas, and both attracted donations in support of their development. They also both attracted patronage from high-profile philanthropic women. Goods from both convents were displayed at industrial exhibitions in Ireland and abroad with the help of women like Lady Aberdeen and the Countess of Arran. And these were events which often displayed the goods, gave prizes for the goods, and attested to the high quality of the goods produced by Irish convent industries. So I'll say more about the retailing of these goods shortly, but I think it's first worth noting that charitable donations as well as loans were vital to the business model of each enterprise. Both businesses were indebted for some years, initially having needed capital to buy looms and build workhouses, of course, and they struggled financially at times as a result. In 1891, the nuns in Skibbereen reported to their local bishop that they were having to cut wages to workers. Briefly, they said, so that because they had so little cash on hand. And the nuns in Skibbereen at this point tried to gain state funding from the new Economic Development Agency, the Congested Districts Board. It's not clear that they received any, but Foxford certainly was funded by the Congested Districts Board to the tune of several £1,000s, and was later often touted as one of the Congested District Board's major success stories. But it was notable that even when receiving grants and selling goods for profit in some volume, the Foxford nuns were still soliciting and receiving charitable donations and bequests to support this work, as this list of benefactors, roughly from its first decade, shows. Now, of course, this was something that their commercial rivals within the textile industry were not doing and could not do. And this hints at the tensions that enterprises like this brought into the marketplace, and indeed public clashes with other local business interests arose in both cases. In 1893, an apparent dispute emerged in Foxford about the woolen mill's use of the River Moy to run its mill race. This was something that the owner of a local salmon fishery in the same river objected to, because he said it was depriving him of a volume of water downstream. Unsurprisingly, local opinion lined up behind the nuns, and the salmon fishery owner next turns up giving out prizes in the factory. So he's obviously silenced and then co-opted by the formidable Mother Bernard. In Skibbereen, the nuns found their weaving industry the subject of rumours, meanwhile, rumours that they were not actually producing all of the goods in the convent workrooms. These were likely started by rival firms who were vying for contracts to provide textiles to the local workhouse, given the timing involved. I don't believe the rumours to be true. But in any case, what this shows is that it's evident that convent industries had an advantage in terms of setting up and being able to produce these goods, in sourcing startup and development capital. And that was because of the very clearly articulated goodwill of a wider community towards them and their aims. And obviously loans and grants from state agencies are one thing, and they're a thing that commercial enterprises would be able to compete for too. But the nuns could also call on investors who wanted no return for their investment, no return perhaps other than a spiritual one, and that was a distinct advantage. But did that obvious advantage in terms of acquisition of capital also translate into an advantage in trade, in selling the goods that they produced? Well, an examination of the different ways the Skibbereen and Foxford enterprises marketed themselves and retailed the goods that they produced, and how the language used in advertising over time changes, would suggest that the answer could be, in the short term, perhaps yes, but in the long term, no. So in the first place, the two convents had in common that they emphasised, as I mentioned earlier, the high quality and therefore, of course, the higher cost of the goods that they produced, as against what was routinely dismissed as Scotch and English shoddy. Now, if there are any textile historians here, you'll know that shoddy is a legitimate term for material produced using recycled rags. I suspect it was often used in these contexts as a sort of catch-all to denigrate British produced textiles as a whole. But you can see here the emphasis of quality is something that does come up in the marketing of the goods. This is a rare newspaper advertisement for referencing Skibbereen produced goods. And the linens are described as beautiful, as specialities with a lovely finish, and the manufacture of high reputation, and inspection is invited, so they're very confident in the quality of the goods. Foxford used newspaper advertising more regularly in its early years, and the evolution of its marketing language is I think interesting to note. Again, you have this 1893 advert where the favourable comparison with other goods, Scotch or imported material, it says, is noted. But this is also by way of buttressing a very prominent claim for consumers' patronage based on their position in Irish industry. So right at the top it says support Irish industry, and then the tagline, keep the money at home, thereby help to restore Irish trade. This line, prominent as it is in this advert, seems to disappear a little from subsequent adverts in later years. Indeed, by this point, Foxford adverts have become a bit more subtle. So there's no reference to sort of buy Irish there. They're talking about the nuns' mills here, charity purposes there. And then you've got a sort of dilution of the earlier kind of buy Irish line, friends of the poor encourage Irish industry, at the bottom of this advert. And in part, this sort of dilution of that kind of language might be because other Irish companies in the commercial sphere producing textiles could and did use this Buy Irish line as well. And in fact, if we put this 1890 advert from a Donegal commercial textile firm next to one from the one we saw earlier from Foxford Mills, I think we can see fairly clearly that they've copied a good deal of their marketing technique from there. The idea of supporting Irish industry, even down to the wool kind of headline that grabs you. So that might be one reason why that sort of emphasis on Buy Irish disappears, because commercial companies were making that claim too. A very close version of the second advert, the Foxford advert, does turn up again later, and I think that's after the Donegal company have stopped using the advert. I'm not certain at this stage if it's because the Donegal firm is perhaps out of action. In fact, though, I think what's most interesting about, the advertising is very rich, but I think what's most unexpected and interesting is the degree to which newspaper advertising wasn't used by the nuns in marketing the goods that they were producing in their workrooms. I've done some cursory searches of online newspaper databases, which suggests that what are now highly controversial convent laundries, so laundries attached to convents, which were also another sort of common practice in the late 19th century, that they frequently did use advertising columns in newspapers to tout for business. But it seems to have been much less common for convent factories producing actually, goods for retail sale to do so. So, how did they retail their wares if they weren't doing it this way? In the case of the Skibbereen linen weavers, publicity seems to have been generated mainly through that time-honoured charity tactic of securing sympathetic and, of course, crucially free coverage in the news columns of newspapers. And for example, you see here a series of photographs which circulated. This is just a couple from a series of photographs which circulated showing a bright and clean workshop in Skibbereen, full of modern looms and neatly dressed women and girls hard at work. And the goodwill generated by this, as well as involvement in aforementioned industrial exhibitions, saw the sisters secure some contracts to provide linens to public institutions, to workhouses and to lunatic asylums and so on. But that route of retailing their goods could sometimes be a hard sell. One Board of Guardians meeting in Skibbereen itself, so in the very town that the convent was in, discussed how the nuns don't want any profit, they only want to keep the work in the town, and found the convent material, they confirmed the convent material to be much superior to commercial alternatives. But the fact that it was more expensive as a result of that was judged hard on their poor ratepayers, and as a result, only a portion of the contract that was up for discussion, only a portion of the business was actually given to the convent. And I think clearly, reading the discussion that's going on here, clearly the decision was made on philanthropic rather than commercial grounds. And as we saw also then in a previous advertisement, at least one department store in Cork City stocked Skibbereen convent goods as well, so that was another route for them to market. I think it's also worth noting at this point that the ultimate aim of the nuns in building the workrooms, in building up the skills, in producing the goods, and in creating this demand, what they hoped would be a secure line of demand for these products. Their ultimate aim was that the looms would be taken out of the convent workrooms and put into the individual homes of workers, and a new and what they hoped sustainable cottage industry would be formed as a result of that. The nuns at Foxford pursued rather a very different path when it came to selling their goods. They too were not averse to the free publicity which comes in newspapers, and I have a nice example here from a US newspaper's women's column in New York in 1896. And Foxford nuns also enthusiastically took part in industrial exhibitions and saw their goods stocked by department stores as well. And here's an advert from Arnott's in Dublin, which is that rare 19th century department store which is still in business. And so they had multiple routes to selling their goods as well, but they also used, and this is crucial, sales agents extensively, something which evidently brought them far more business than the sort of tendering for contracts with individual institutions did for the Skibbereen sisters. And it does need to be noted that while the Foxford mill has thrived into the present, and I'm sitting on a Foxford rug, in fact, that somebody gifted me a couple of years ago, and you can go and buy one now on their website if you wish. It's a thriving business. The Skibbereen weaving industry seems to have fizzled out really by the time of its founder, Mother de Sille's death in 1910, and significantly before that, it seems, because in her obituary in 1910, the weaving industry gets a passing mention and a mention in the past tense as well. So by 1910, it seems to have been sort of long concluded. So, what can we conclude from the different fortunes of these two convent textile enterprises, and what larger points might it hint at in regard to charity retail and charity enterprise more broadly? I have three kind of related points to make that I'll finish on. So the first point is that goodwill from potential consumers towards the philanthropic aims of the businesses only got them so far. Creating employment that tempered poverty and prevented emigration, as all of the nuns stated was their aim, was widely acknowledged as a noble aim, but it was also one that commercial competitors within Ireland, who were also employing people and paying them wages, could just as easily claim, as we've seen with the sort of Buy Irish line. So if convent industries created compassionate consumers, it wasn't necessarily on an exclusive or on a lasting basis. The second related point is that creating goods of high quality that cost more than those produced elsewhere was a marketing tactic that again only worked up to a point. Paying more for a product that might be got cheaper elsewhere, even if it was of a lesser quality, was something that attempted to appeal to people as rational consumers. They were saying, you might spend more, but this will last longer. It's the rational choice to make. But underlying this really was always a message to people as charitable donors who should feel better about spending more because it was supporting a worthy cause. So, these two things I think were always in tension. And the final point is that charity enterprise succeeded best when it operated in the modern industrial landscape and the modern retail marketplace. So the Sisters of Charity in Foxford succeeded in the longer term because while they obviously pressed their advantage as nuns and as philanthropists in terms of securing loans and grants and large donations to fund and develop the business, they were nonetheless creating something that was a recognisably modern enterprise. They had a dedicated factory with modern equipment, an advertising strategy that, as we've seen, evidently took account of how other commercial businesses were selling themselves in that period. And they made use of sales agents around Ireland and in expanding markets in Britain and the US. And this all spoke of an enterprise that was of its time, of its era, in the positive sense, that was up to date in its methods. The Sisters of Mercy in Skibbereen, meanwhile, seemed to be not nearly so contemporary in their operation. Their ultimate aim of putting the looms in the workers' cottages arguably harked back to an 18th century version of the textile industry, one that had been famously superseded by the Industrial Revolution. And even the comment of that sympathetic Poor Law Guardian about the sisters that they don't want any profit, they only want to keep the work in the town, hinted at an operation that was much more charity than it was enterprise. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So yes, let's thank Sarah for a fantastic talk again. Just, I think, really showing the real kind of value there is in exploring the histories of charities as businesses, and that kind of using those business history techniques, which you did so well in that first book that I put the link in the chat, which is a really kind of great, I think, kind of step forward in that. I think that's one of the big areas within the history of charity and voluntary organisations that we need to be looking at, and I've certainly done that in my work, like looking at accounts, looking at these adverts, looking at all of this. I have just Googled Foxford Woolen Mills, and their products look beautiful.
Oh, they are beautiful.
And it also quite interesting on that website, they kind of keep pointing out that they were founded by women and they've been woven in Ireland since 1892 and all of this. So that's quite interesting in its own right. So let's pass straight on to George Gosling from the University of Wolverhampton, where he's a senior lecturer and in history. And George is writing a book on the history of charity retail, and I'm sure he'll tell us more about this particular aspect of that book, because it's quite a wide-ranging project.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I'm going to try and make my talk today less wide-ranging, but it's always a bit difficult when I get started on this. There's a lot to say, but I'm going to try and move us a little bit chronologically and geographically. Going to take us from Foxford to Oxford, and what I'm going to look at in my talk for this session is really to focus on the period when charity shops became a kind of common feature in British life, which I put it between the 1940s and 1970s. And what I want to suggest here is that there was not just one kind of fixed and accepted kind of model of charity retail at the time, but there were at least two different models, both part of longer traditions, and that they both played a role in shaping what we know of the charity retail sector today and what it came to be. So we really need to understand both of them if we want to understand how things came about. So the first is one that we might associate with a particular shop, with the one we're seeing in the picture here, which was Oxfam's first shop that was set up on Broad Street in Oxford in the run-up to Christmas in 1947. And this, there's a kind of romantic foundation story that Oxfam's very, very proud of with this, where you have Oxfam kind of appealing for clothes that can be sent to Greece, where there's a famine at the end of the Second World War. And as the story runs, they're sort of inundated with donations, so they give over the ground floor of their offices to set up a shop to sell the surplus as fundraising. Which slightly misrepresents the kind of items they were selling from the very beginning, but it's a kind of meaningful origin story for this part of the charity's work. Their retail and trading is such an important part of what Oxfam is and how it understands itself. So it's meaningful there, I think, as an institutional story. But I think it would be a mistake to think of this as the invention of the charity shop, or that Oxfam's kind of intervention or kind of their arrival in the world of retail is somehow the kind of first chapter in a wider history of charity retail. What I've been doing over the last few years, or what I was doing for a few years up until things stopped about 18 months ago, was spending a lot of time in charity archives trying to piece together what is this kind of longer history of British charities running shops. And the earliest one I found is actually exactly 150 years before Oxfam's shop is set up. If anyone knows an earlier one, I'd love to hear about it. But the earliest one I've found is in 1797, up in Northumberland, where a charity sets up initially a philanthropic corn mill. During the Napoleonic Wars, at a time when there's a lot of hunger, they start off by producing and selling food, and then their shop kind of broadens out to sell household items as well. So this is not at all fundraising. You know, the charitable act here is to be able to sell cheap items that people need to get by. The earliest fundraising shop I found was actually in 1870, which was not at all selling second-hand goods. It was actually a flower shop in the West End of London, raising money for a mission in the East End. And we've already heard from Ruth this morning about the Salvation Army and how from the 1880s there were their trading and retail operations, including the sale of unwanted second-hand goods as part of a wider social project. And if I can make these slides work, this is then where we get things like the Salvage stores by the early 20th century. And there's obviously a focus on thrift in the way these shops are running, and what we get in Oxfam perhaps includes that, but also brings into a formal shop space that longer tradition of the fundraising charity bazaar, which we can date back at least to the 1820s. And it brings these things in on perhaps a more formal footing in the 1940s. And at this moment in the 1940s, Broad Street in Oxford is important, just not initially just because of Oxfam. In fact, for much of the Second World War, there was a much larger second-hand fundraising store. Initially, it was raising money for Indian famine relief, and then in February 1944, it was taken over as a Red Cross and St. John gift shop. And this was actually just about 130 yards away from where the Oxfam shop would later be set up. It was on the corner of Broad Street and Cornmarket Street. So for those of you who know Oxford, I'm pretty sure the side of the road it was on, I'm pretty sure it's what today is the big Waterstones. And so if you know that, you may know it's a huge shop. And this was a really major undertaking. The rota I found in the Red Cross archive lists 6 sellers for every shift, along with another volunteer on the till. And this was a much more profitable kind of operation than the Oxfam shop in its early days. It wouldn't kind of catch up in terms of profitability until the 1960s. But in the 18 months of wartime trading as a Red Cross shop, this shop made, it raised £16,880. Now, if we adjusted for inflation today, that would be something in the region of £750,000. So this was a really large-scale, profitable operation, and this is just one Red Cross shop. There was over 100 of them in a kind of national network across the country. But what happened with that shop, unlike Oxfam, is that at the end of the war, they had to vacate their premises. So what they did was they moved around different premises around Oxford's kind of central shopping area, up until the 1970s, when the Red Cross rethought its retail operations more generally and tended to move towards hospital shops instead of fundraising gift shops. But while the Red Cross had a sort of ongoing retail presence around Oxford's central kind of shopping area, during this time, it was Oxfam that became synonymous with second-hand fundraising shops. So this was made possible, I would say, both by the fact that the Oxfam shop expanded, it spread out over 2 floors and became more profitable, but also because of the impressive PR operation that the charity embarked upon. And this resulted in Oxfam becoming, I would say, a source of inspiration for the kind of new wave of charity shops that opened throughout the late 1960s and 1970s. I'd say it's a source of inspiration, but I think it would be a mistake to think that these new shops were directly imitating what was happening on Broad Street. People like Jessica Field have written about the attempts to kind of copy and spread out and learn from this sort of more professional approach to charity retail. But even Oxfam's own local branches tended to run shops that were less professional, less commercially minded than their own flagship store. And what we've already heard about this idea that it might be, seen as perhaps it's good to spend more because there's a kind of charitable cause here. That's very much the kind of attitude and approach that you get from someone like Joe Mitty, who is the shop manager for Oxfam on Broad Street. But it's quite different from what I've been finding in local newspaper stories in the late 60s and early 70s, when these same charities have local shops opening up, and they barely mention the actual charitable work that's being done. They'll mention the name of the charity, but apart from that, the focus really is on selling the range of goods they have, the bargains that you can find. So this is kind of one model of charity retail with variations in it, but I'd say that that's one model. And then I'd say that there's a second one. A second model of charity retail that was really a different approach to an arrangement for selling new goods. And this is not always entirely separate from what we've been talking about already, but it is, I'd say, distinct in a number of ways. So what you tended to get in the 1960s was a real trend for charities setting up trading companies run by trading directors and with paid staff. Oxfam does this in 1964, and you have Save the Children, Christian Aid and others copying in the years after. And the trading officers or directors typically would have 3 main jobs. Firstly, to organize the supply of a line of items that could be sold. Some of these might be linked to the objects of the charity in different ways. Others could be seasonal items, things like Christmas cards or gifts, which might be kind of branded by the charity, might have some link to the kind of charitable work they were doing, but often not. By 1970, Bernardo's is selling espresso machines at Christmas time. So it's not always that closely linked to their own charitable work. So firstly, they are organizing the supply of this kind of line of items. Secondly, they would be setting up and running a kind of mail order catalog service as one way of selling them. And then thirdly, they might centrally direct and if necessary establish a chain of stores with paid staff for doing this kind of retail work. Now, of course, trading charities as we know from what we've been hearing today, you know, they're not at all new in the 1960s. The Salvation Army had its trading operations. We've already heard, I think twice now, how so Roddy and her co-authors have talked about this as sort of being like a Salvationist department store. And that really is quite an apt description. But we've got other things going on as well, other kinds of charities that are trading, very much alongside what we were hearing about from in Ireland. You have disability charities setting up shops. So the earliest one I've actually found by coincidence is local to my university. In the 1890s, you got the Wolverhampton Society for the Blind setting up their shop. And you have a number of different charities, including disability charities, setting up retail operations to kind of try and find a market for deserving producers. They might be groups like blind or other disabled groups. It might be international charities. Often in those cases, they tended not to set up their own shops. They might be selling through things like industrial exhibitions, through mail order operations, and these sorts of things. One of the differences here a bit, and this fits with what we've been hearing about already from Sarah, unlike the Salvation Army, these charities would usually tend to, they wouldn't be expecting to make money from these operations. I repeatedly find them being judged a success if they have covered their costs whilst helping to find a market for these deserving producers. And what we have in the 1960s then is at the same time as these trading companies are being increasingly set up, there's also a shift away from shops towards relying on mail order as the way that you do this. This is what we see, for example, with St Dunstan's, which had been running a shop on Regent Street for goods made by blind veterans from, you know, that shop in particular was there from the 20s, but closed in the 60s, and they put the focus on mail order. You've got the same sort of thing that's happening with the failure of the first Christian Aid shop, which was actually set up on Sloane Street, just about 5 minutes down from Knightsbridge, so in the very fashionable part of Belgravia. They had a shop between 1964 and 1970, where they were selling largely focused on these sorts of goods from Kenya. So as you can see down the bottom, you know, these were goods that were being made and sold in Mombasa, but they were also being sold internationally through Christian Aid. And these were traditional crafts, but also clothes that might include, you know, there might be traditional fabrics, but often in quite modern and Western designs, including ponchos and dresses that might cost up to the equivalent of £50 today. So selling these items at high costs, selling them in a shop run by paid staff, and having that shop in a fashionable part of London like Belgravia, all of this was of course incredibly expensive. And after 6 years, Christian Aid decided not to run any more shops like this. So what they did then, there's a kind of rethinking, and this is part of a wider trend of rethinking what is the relationship between these two different types of retail? How do our shops fit in? So what you start getting then is perhaps a line of goods can be sold in the volunteer run shops that might focus more typically on secondhand goods, bringing the two together in a way that they weren't particularly before that. So what you have is that in the official history of Oxfam, Maggie Black talks about the arrival of the trading companies as having a kind of positive influence on these local local branch run secondhand shops. One of the things she says is that by having these new goods, by having Christmas cards and things they can put in the window, it encourages merchandising. They can learn how to do kind of professional shop merchandising. But really, what I've been finding going through the charity's archives is a less harmonious relationship in practice. Save the Children and others, I found repeated arguments about how they're going to balance the two, particularly whether the central charity with perhaps the trading officer in the trading company, how they are working with those local branches running the shops. Often what we find is that the local branches are not even telling the charity centrally how much money they're making from the shops. In some cases, I've even found them not knowing whether local branches had shops or not. So it was very much something they were doing off on their own. So what you get then is an attempt over particularly in the 1970s, for charities with their trading directors to try and coordinate and bring some kind of some direction, and ideally a more professional approach to how these charities are being run. But there is a huge amount of tension between them. And that's not just about debates about who gets to keep the money. Usually you'd have the local branches having to send back the money they make from trading company goods, but also an idea that these are different kinds of shops. And this is what you have in Save the Children, is that the branches are often refusing by 1976. They are refusing in some cases to stock the trading company goods because they say they are off-putting to their second-hand clientele. So what I just want to finish by saying really is that we've got some very different ideas about what charity retail is and should be going on here. And I think this has some kind of contemporary relevance because of course, charity shops and charities running shops get a lot of stick for the different kinds of approaches they take, with the idea that maybe they are drifting away from what they should be doing. And really, I think what we can see here is that there is no one set approach or idea of what the charity shop is. The charity's relationship with its paid staff or its volunteers, with its supporters, perhaps trying to turn them into customers, and with the people it's supporting. These are all, there are different approaches being taken throughout the time that the charity shop becomes a familiar feature in British life. So I guess history, we might say, kind of cautions us against assuming that there is one correct or original or legitimate idea of what a charity shop is or should be. And perhaps that's something we might pick up in the discussion. Then I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, George, for that again. So opening up quite a few points, which I think we're going to hear much more about in terms of the contemporary from our next speaker, from Robin Osterley. I'm really delighted that you've kind of managed to make the time, which I'm sure must be an incredibly kind of busy job at the moment, given the kind of challenges that are facing the charity retail sector in the last year and a half. So I'm really pleased, Robin, that you've been able to come to speak to us. And we had hoped to have you, we had hoped to kind of work with you a year ago on our kind of idea of having this immersive pop-up charity shop. One day we'll get there. I'm hopeful, when things get back to something like new normal. But please, Robin, Chief Executive of the Charity Retail Association, over to you.
Thank you very much, Georgina, and thank you very much for the invite. I'm not a historian. In fact, I didn't even take a history O-level, which is probably just as well, because I'm sure I would have failed it if I had. I'm not an academic and I'm not a historian, and I've been absolutely fascinated to hear the presentations of those who are. So interesting in terms of locating charity retail in society. My job, I guess, is to bring us up to date, to try and give you some idea of where charity retail currently stands, and some of the challenges that it faces. Yeah, but some of the interesting ways in which, particularly the kind of antecedents that George explained, have played themselves out in modern charity retail sector. So I guess there are several different types of charity shop in the 21st century, and it might be just worth rehearsing that a bit. So the sort of straightforward trading commercial kind of activity that actually all the speakers have talked about to a greater or lesser extent sort of finds itself, I think, in a few places. Particularly those charities that have substantial amounts of property that they can use to sell stuff in. So you might be thinking of people like the National Trust, the RSPB, RNLI in particular, and you know, quite a few of those kinds of charities who've got property, and they sometimes make a corner of them available, and they would be selling branded goods, new goods, almost exclusively, and they make a substantial amount of money out of those things, and who I have no idea how much, but they clearly are successful, otherwise they probably wouldn't continue. So that's one type of charity shop. The second type of charity shop that you might be aware of has also been mentioned by our previous speakers, and these are enterprises. These are much more social enterprises than charities. These are enterprises who are really running activities, really, rather than retail, but they use retail to fund those activities. So in this context, you could think of a, I don't know, bicycle shop whose principal job is to repair bicycles. We've got quite a few of these around the country. But it isn't just that they're repairing bicycles, they're actually providing skills improvement for youngsters. They're giving people trades, they're working with their local colleges in order to help teach people. And what they end up doing is selling those bicycles as a result to keep those skills-based activities going. There's quite a few furniture shops that do that kind of thing. So that's probably the third, hang on, where are we? That's the second type of charitable shop. And the third, I suppose, is the successor to Oxfam, is the traditional charity shop. And we, the Charity Resale Association, are essentially involved in looking after those guys. There's about 11,200 such charity shops across the UK, or at least there were prior to the pandemic, and virtually all of the stats that I'm about to give you are pre-pandemic. Of those 11,200, we've got nearly 9,000 in membership, so we are really very heavily represented. And this is the kind of charity shop, obviously, whose principal income is from goods that have been donated by members of the public. And I use the word members of the public quite advisedly, really, rather than supporters, which is something that people quite often talk about. Supporters implies a sort of kind of loyalty in some ways. And I'm not trying to say that people who donate to charity shops are disloyal, far from it. They're often very loyal to their charity shops, but they would quite often spread their largesse around and donate goods to quite a wide range of charity shops. And certainly when it comes to buying from charity shops, people tend to buy in a very diffuse way. So they will walk from charity shop to charity shop to charity shop to charity shop, find something they like, and they'll buy it there regardless of the cause. So they're much less supporters and much more members of the public who find this way of shopping to be something different, to be something exciting and new, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So I guess the rest of my presentation is likely to be talking about those traditional types of charity shops, which are the most obvious successors to the historical perspectives that have already been looked at, but by no means the only ones. So one of the most amazing things I think about these 11,200 shops that are around the UK is the diversity of the charities to which they belong. So our largest member is British Heart Foundation. They've got about 750 shops. That makes them an absolutely enormous retailer in the UK. I don't mean charity retailer, I mean retailer in the UK. They really are up there with the big boys, with WH Smith and all of those kinds of people. The smallest of our members has no charity shops. They're just members in order to see if it's a business that they'd like to get into. And many of our members have only one shop. So I like to quote our next door village has got a special school in it. The special school opened a charity shop in the village, which has been extremely successful. And that's the only shop it has. Between those two extremes, there's pretty much everything. So the biggest four are BHF, Oxfam, Barnardo's and Cancer Research UK. We've got a number of national chains in addition to that, people like Shelter and Mind, Sue Ryder, and then a whole range of shops based around hospices, much more at a local level, who might have 40 or 50 shops. Air ambulances, also very locally based, who might have 20, 30, 40 shops. And really a huge diversity. I just want to throw at you, if I may, some stats about what this sector actually means for society as a whole and for the charities that they support. So across those 11,200, we're looking at around a profit for charities of around £1/3 of £1 billion a year, from a turnover of something in the region of 1.4 billion. So that is an incredible sum of money. And it means, as I've quoted on numerous occasions, it means that for every month that they were shut during during lockdown, charities lost around £28 million every month from their shop networks. And that's, I'm talking about profit, not profit contribution. And that money is particularly important to charities because, as those of you who are at all familiar with charity accounting will know, it's unrestricted funds. It's funds that they can spend on anything, and those are the hardest funds for charities to raise. It's relatively easier, and I use the word relatively advisedly as well, it's relatively easy to raise funds for projects where you have to spend the money on those projects than it is to raise funds for things like keeping the lights on and paying the rent and paying your salaries and those kinds of things. But charity shops provide that. And this was really exemplified when shops started reopening last June, and after they had been shut, after charities' income essentially had dropped to zero. And the shops were able to open and almost instantaneously provide usable cash to the charities. You can't resurrect the London Marathon or fundraising events, generally speaking, if you shut down, but you can reopen your shop and start getting cash in pretty quickly. So what do those shops actually sell? Well, it is still true that the vast majority of what those shops sell are goods that have been donated from members of the public. So that's about 70% of their income, something in that sort of region. Bought-in goods represent around 16, so in other words, new goods represent around 16.5% of their income. They get a remarkably small amount of money from their from the stuff that they sell to recyclers. That's only about 2.5%. Gift aid reclaims represent about 5.7%, and about 3% of their income actually comes from cash donations that take place in the store. So that just gives you some idea of what's going on there. That large sum of money, that £3 billion a year, is what we all think of really as the raison d'etre for charity shops. And undoubtedly it is. I mean, there's a sort of Mr. McCorber thing going on here. If it doesn't make any money, it's like, the result is unhappiness. If it makes money, the result is happiness. But of course, they have to make money in order to pay their staff. So there's about 25,500 professional staff in charity shops around the country. And probably around 230,000 volunteers. So that makes us the largest volunteer force in the UK, the largest single volunteer force in the UK. So, clearly to keep these shops open, running, keeping the staff paid and the volunteers happy is a significant investment for charities. But that £3 billion is extraordinarily important to the charities, as I've said. So most people think that's what a charity shop is there to do, and of course they're right. But as we've mentioned on numerous occasions, and we actually ran a campaign in Northern Ireland to this effect, they are so much more than a shop. They're so much more than a shop in ways which I think have become slightly clearer to me since hearing the previous presentations, which I think is very interesting. The first thing is the whole sort of community hub nature of charities, charity shops, particularly in town centres, actually sort of market town centres, where these places become meeting points, places where volunteers and customers go that are going to be a bit different. You pop into a charity shop and browse. You can browse as long as you like. You can start chatting to the staff. You can start chatting to the customers. You try and do that in Primark. Before too long, a big sort of hefty security guard will come along and politely ask you to move on. This does not happen in charity shops. There is a home for people there, which many people take a massive advantage of. Secondly, they're increasingly important as skill centres, I suppose, places where particularly young people can go to gain some skills and particularly experience and a reference. It's amazing how important that is. If you're a youngster who's never been employed and you try and work in retail or in any other profession, and you haven't got anything on your CV and you haven't got a reference, or if you're a vulnerable adult in a similar situation, or if you've just come out of prison, or if you've just recovered from significant health issues and you've got nothing on your CV and no one is prepared to write their name down and say that you're a decent person who doesn't steal the silver and turns up on time. A charity shop can provide all of that through its volunteering activity. Customer service skills, cash handling skills, these days online skills, all of these things can be learned in a charity shop, and they're becoming an increasingly important part of the high street ecology as a result. And thirdly, the most and one of the most significant things is the extraordinarily positive environmental impact that charity shops provide. And this, I think, is something that no one really would have predicted 50 or 60 years ago. And I don't think Oxfam had that in mind when they opened in 1940. Whatever it was, but it has become hugely significant. Obviously, there's a bit of a backlash against fast fashion. There's much more of a zeitgeist for sustainable purchasing in all sorts of different ways. And you might be interested to know that charity shops in general keep around a third of, 330,000 tons of textiles out of landfill or incineration every year. And we reckon that's something in the region of half of the UK's annual textile production is being kept out of landfill or incineration by charity shops, facilitating the reuse of clothing through by selling it to people. So these are incredibly important aspects in terms of what charity shops provide on the high street. So there's so much more than a shop that is raising money for their own charities. The other thing, so those are the kind of basic statistics and the basic makeup of shops at the moment. How have things been going? They've been going exceptionally well since reopening, but as I mentioned, they were shut for 6 to 7 months of the last 12 months, and it's obviously been very painful for them. Still, however, on reopening, amazingly powerful sales statistics. Many volunteers have come back, though we suspect that 30 to 40% of them probably haven't. A few shops have been lost, although I'm fairly confident that those will be made up over the next 12 months, actually, as sales continue to thrive. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the whole professionalism thing and the whole business model thing, which George in particular alluded to, because I think this is very interesting. So we now have hardly any members who run shops which are entirely volunteer-led. The last bastion of running shops that are entirely volunteer-led was Save the Children. They're moving away from that model. They still do have a few, but they are moving away from that model because of the fact that if you invest in a professional shop manager, the chances of you increasing your income more than the cost of that shop manager are actually pretty good. And certainly since the last recession, the last major recession in 2008, we've seen a very large expansion of charity shops. And going alongside that has been a very large expansion of charity shops' profitability as well. So it's been really instructive to see the extent to which bringing people in from fully professional retail backgrounds has made a massive difference. So now I think the charity shop is pretty much unrecognizable from those antecedents that we heard about earlier. You're talking about lots of specialist shops. So, we've got members who sell books, who sell CDs, who sell bridal wear, vintage, retro, exclusively furniture, all sorts of different things, not just your traditional sort of bric-a-brac and clothing. And those things are, require a lot of skill to sell in a lot of cases. We've got superstores. British Heart Foundation opened a massive store in Kingston, which they bought from British Home Stores. So they only had to change one letter on the signpost, which was very handy. So they absolutely huge store. And there's 3 or 4 of such things around the southeast, and they're growing actually in terms of numbers, superstores as well. So different business models. And the business model always is, you sell your donated goods. If you can't sell them over the counter, you would sell them out of the back door to a recycler. Probably about 94% of donated goods actually get sold by one or other methods, 94%. So of the goods that you donate to a charity shop, probably only 6% would end up in waste, and those would typically be items that have been extremely, that are damaged or just for whatever reason completely unsaleable. So the professionalism increases, and we've got plenty of examples actually of heads of retail. This is true of British Heart Foundation. It's true of Bernardo's as well, actually, whose heads of retail actually come from a commercial retail background, injecting new ideas, new merchandising methodology, new techniques for sale. But it's really important for charity shops, I think, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, because there is an aspect of a charity shop which I think is fascinating in retail terms, and that is the extraordinary amount of freedom that the charity shop manager actually gets to run their shop the way that they want. And this is a way in which I think George's suggestion about the kind of plurality, if that's the right word, of the way that charities run. I think this is the way it plays itself out in practice, because charity shop managers have an enormous amount of freedom. They are allowed to merchandise things in the way that they like. They're usually allowed to price them in the way that they like. They're allowed to move them from one shop to another if they think that the demographic of the other shop would be more appropriate to that particular item. And they're allowed to do their own shop windows. And all of these things don't really happen if you're a charity shop, if you're a shop manager in a commercial retail outlet. You're much more circumscribed in the way that you can operate. And so what we're often finding is that commercial shop managers are coming to charity shops because it's just a much more exciting way for them to earn their living, because they have total control over that shop. And yes, they have the sales figures to meet, of course they do. Nobody these days operates on the basis that they won't tell their charities how much they've sold. I don't think they'd last very long if they did that. And obviously EPOS systems are in place, and the whole thing has become a much more modern retail operation, as is totally understandable. But it's very interesting to see how that's developed from the much more kind of casual, if you like, business approach that charities evidently used to take with regard to their shops. And the final thing I wanted to say is an increasingly important trend, which again is has been shown to be anteceded going back even to the 18th and 19th centuries, but an increasingly important trend, which I think we missed for a number of years, of using the charity shop as a literal shop window for the charity's services. So we're finding more and more shops where you can go in and access the charity's services via the shop. So you might be able to sit down and use IT systems to access some of their services, or you might just speak to knowledgeable staff. In the new Cancer Research UK store, and it's not that new now, large store in Stevenage in Hertfordshire, there are some consulting rooms where you can go and chat to them about cancer and get some informal but skilled counselling. One thing that I think is really interesting, and this goes towards the sort of brand on the high street type of thing, is that Barnardo's, who've got one of the largest chains, have a regular occurrence, which is at least once a month, a young person will knock on a charity shop's door across their estate and say, my parents have thrown me out, or I'm being beaten up at home, can you help please? And that's because they're a trusted brand on the high street, they're a visible force on the high street, and people go in and make those kinds of comments. To the other extreme, if you like, cats protection shops have now got live feeds to their cats protection centre in Hayward Heath, so you can go in there, you can see what your money is actually going towards if you spend it in the shop. They will give you an iPad where you can maybe rehome some cats, or if you don't fancy that, you can give it to your kids and they'll play some games while you're shopping. So there's some really interesting and innovative ideas going on there, and shops generally trying to be used more and more as shop windows for the charities' services. So that's really where that sort of brings us up, I think, up to date. It's a much more professional sector, but I guess you would expect that. It's a sector that is incredibly important to charitable income. It's incredibly important as a community hub throughout society and in particular in town centres. And it's providing, and the sector as a whole is providing an incredible amount of positive environmental impact. So that's where we are, and I'm very happy, obviously, when we get to it, to take any questions that might have arisen. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robin. That was really so many statistics. I was trying to write down quite a lot of those really quickly. It's really great to have that presented so clearly for us. Yeah, fantastic way to end. So I'd just like to say thank you once again to our panel very much. If people would like to, in the usual Zoom fashion, I like to turn on our cameras and just wave and say thank you and clap and applaud on camera. If anyone is happy to do that, that would be very nice. It's nice to see who's there, but again, that's entirely up to you. And we've really enjoyed this session. I don't think this is going to be the last of these kind of sessions. George and I have kind of got into a habit of trying to organise things like this because it does generate such a kind of an interest among historians, the wider public, and hopefully among the kind of charity retail profession itself. And maybe that's where we go next with something. So I'm sure we can have this conversation further, but thank you very much to everybody.